By the spring of 1943, 72,000 Allied sailors were already dead in the freezing water of the North Atlantic. Merchant seamen from Baltimore, from Boston, from small towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Boys who had signed on to feed their families and ended up feeding the fish. Every convoy that left New York carried men who knew the odds. Every convoy left more of them behind. This is the story of the weapon that finally stopped it. The weapon nobody was allowed to name, the North Atlantic. May 12, 1943, 600 miles southwest of Iceland. The sky was the color of wet slate. A consolidated Liberator bomber from Royal Air Force No. 86 Squadron pushed through the low cloud at 300 feet, 4 engines droning against a wind that had not stopped blowing for 3 days. Inside the fuselage, the crew had been airborne for 9 hours. Their eyes were red, their fingers were cold. The coffee in the thermos had gone stale hours ago. They were hunting. Below them, the ocean rolled black and gray, endless, indifferent. Somewhere beneath that surface, a German submarine was recharging its batteries. And on this particular afternoon, at this particular latitude, the men in that Liberator carried something in their bomb bay that no one on either side of the war had ever used in combat before. They were not allowed to talk about it, not to their wives, not to their commanding officers, not even to each other, unless the door was closed and the paperwork was signed. Officially, it did not exist. Officially, what they carried was a mine. But mines do not swim. The radar operator hunched over his cast-array screen. And then his voice cut through the intercom, sharp and sudden. Contact. Bearing 045. Range 8 mile. The pilot pushed the throttles forward. The Liberator's nose tipped down. Through a break in the cloud, he saw it, a long, dark shape on the surface, or sliding off its deck, men on the conning tower turning to look up. A Type 7C U-boat, numbered in files that would not be opened for another 2 years as U-456, the submarine dived. The pilot had perhaps 45 seconds before the boat vanished into the black. In the old days, he would have dropped depth charges. Steel drums packed with explosive, tumbling into the swirl where the submarine had been. In the old days, 9 attacks out of 10 failed. The U-boat would turn, change depth, slip sideways through the dark water, and the depth charges would detonate in empty ocean while the crew inside listened to the muffled thunder and smiled. Today was not the old days. Today, the bomb bay omen and something short and fat and painted gray fell into the sea. It hit the water with a splash, and then it began to listen. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in Berlin, an admiral stood in front of a wall-sized chart of the Atlantic. His name was Karl Dönitz. He was 51 years old, thin, hollow-cheeked, meticulous. 4 months earlier, in January of 1943, he had been promoted to Grand Admiral and given command of the entire German Navy. But his heart was still with the submarines, and on the chart in front of him, small red flags marked the positions of his boats. There were hundreds of them. He was winning. He had been winning for 2 years. Karl Dönitz had once commanded a single U-boat in the First World War. He had been sunk, captured, held prisoner. He had spent the years between the wars thinking about only one thing: how to use submarines to strangle Great Britain. Not one submarine at a time, hunting alone. Many submarines at once, hunting together. Coordinated by radio. Directed from a room like this one. He called it the Wolf Pack. By the spring of 1943, Karl Dönitz had built the deadliest submarine force in the history of the world. In 1942, his U-boats had sunk more than 1,400 Allied ships. 6.2 million tons of cargo sent to the bottom of the ocean. Food, fuel, ammunition, tanks, aircraft. Every ton of steel and grain and gasoline that Great Britain needed to stay alive was being torn open in the freezing water of the North Atlantic and dragged down into the dark. In March of 1943, in a single month, Dunnes's men had sunk 108 merchant ships. In London, Winston Churchill, 68 years old, cigar in his fingers, wrote later that the only thing which ever really frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. Not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion, not the bombs that had fallen on his own city, the submarines. Because if the submarines won, Britain would starve. And if Britain starved, the war would end. Not in victory, not in defeat, in silence. And in the spring of 1943, the submarines were winning. The problem was physics. The Allies had a device called ASDIC, or Sonar. It sent sound waves into the water. And when those waves bounced off a submarine's steel hull, they came back as an echo. A trained operator could hear that echo through his headphones, and from it he could calculate range, bearing, and depth. Sonar worked. At long range, it worked beautifully. But sonar had a flaw, a fatal geometric flaw. As an attacking ship closed to within 200 yards of a submerged submarine, the beam of sound had to angle steeply downward to reach the target. And at a certain point, that angle became so steep that the sound waves could no longer bounce cleanly back to the ship. At exactly the moment the attacker needed to drop its depth charges, the sonar went silent. The Allies called it the dead zone. The U-boat commanders called it something else. Oh, they called it a gift. Every German captain knew about those last 200 yards. Every captain knew that when the destroyer up above stopped calling out corrections, the ship had gone blind. All he had to do was change course, change depth, wait for the muffled explosions in the empty water above him, and then continue his patrol. In 1942, fewer than 1 in 10 depth charge attacks on a submerged submarine resulted in a kill. The situation was even worse from the air. A patrol bomber might spot a U-boat on the surface, but the moment the submarine dived, the aircraft had nothing. No sonar, no way to see into the water. The pilot could estimate where the submarine might be going, could drop his depth charge into the swirl of foam where it had disappeared. But a U-boat descending at a steep angle and turning hard could be hundreds of yards from where the pilot expected. For every U-boat killed by an aircraft in 1942, roughly 11 attacks had failed. 11 wasted weapons, 11 wasted flights, 11 submarines free to hunt again the next night. And in the middle of the North Atlantic, there was a region 1,000 miles wide where no Allied aircraft could reach at all. A gap in the map, a stretch of open water beyond the range of every land-based bomber flying from Iceland, from Newfoundland, from Northern Ireland. The Germans called it the Black Pit. Karl Dönitz, standing in front of his chart in Berlin, sent his wolf packs there. He knew what the Allies could and could not do. He knew where their aircraft could and could not fly. He knew to within 100 miles the exact stretch of ocean where his submarines were safe from the sky. He was not lucky. He was not gambling. He was reading the physics of the war and using it against his enemy. And that is the thing you must understand about Karl Dönitz. He was not a man of instinct. He was a man of engineering. He treated the ocean like a mathematical problem, and every month the numbers on his desk told him the same thing. Germany was going to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Unless something changed, something did. But it did not begin in a shipyard. It did not begin in a naval headquarters. It began 3 days at Pearl Harbor, in a room at Harvard University, at a table where no one was wearing a uniform. December 10th, 1941. Cambridge, Massachusetts. Snow on the ground outside. The war was 3 days old for America. New York was still adjusting to blackout curtains. In Washington, generals and admirals were arguing about aircraft carriers and battleships and where to send the first divisions of soldiers. But in a quiet meeting room at the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory, none of those questions mattered. At the head of the table sat a man named Vannevar Bush, 52 years old,
trained as an electrical engineer at MIT, now the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the civilian agency that controlled every wartime science program in the United States, including a certain project in the desert of New Mexico that would one day be called Manhattan.
Around the table sat physicists from Harvard, engineers from Bell Telephone Laboratory, Orsies in New Jersey, representatives from General Electric, men from Western Electric who normally designed batteries for streetcars, and a small delegation from the United States Navy who had come to ask a single question: was it possible? They wanted to know, to build a torpedo that could hear. A torpedo small enough to drop from an aircraft. A torpedo that, upon hitting the water, would search for the sound of a submarine's propellers and turn toward that sound and follow it all the way to the target without any further guidance from the pilot who had dropped it. A torpedo that hunted the way a dog hunts, by scent, by instinct, by the pull of something it could sense but not see. The scientists around the table were quiet for a long moment, because the answer was not obvious. No one had ever built a guidance system small enough to fit inside a torpedo. No one had ever built a hydrophone sensitive enough to hear a submarine over the roaring noise of the torpedo's own motor. No one had ever built a control system that could translate the difference between 4 microphones into a rudder command fast enough, cleanly enough, that a weapon traveling underwater could correct its course in real time. No one had ever taught a machine to listen and then act on what it heard. But the men in that room were not military engineers. They came from an industry whose entire purpose had been to capture sound, carry it, and deliver it intact to a human ear. They understood signal. They understood silence. They understood how to teach a machine to hear. And
after a long silence,
one of them said the words that would change the Battle of the Atlantic. Difficult, but perhaps not impossible. The project was assigned a number, Project 61. It was given to the Office of Scientific Research and Development. It was given a code name that was, in its own quiet way, perfect. They called it Fido, like a dog that follows a scent. But here is the strangest thing about the story that follows, the most important thing, the thing that will shape everything that comes next in this account. The men who built Fido were not soldiers. They were not weapons designers. Most of them had never touched a piece of force ordnance in their lives. They spent their careers building telephones and radios and refrigerator motors and the batteries that powered flashlights. And in 15 months, using nothing but parts they already had on their workbenches, vacuum tubes from switchboards, microphones adapted from Sonar sets, an electric motor borrowed from a household appliance, a lead-acid battery of the kind found in a passenger car, they were going to build the first weapon in human history that could choose its own target. The first weapon that could think, and they were going to hide it inside a lie so simple, so mundane, so unremarkable, that the Germans would spend the next 2 years trying to defend themselves against a threat they could not name and could not imagine. They were going to call it a mine. Back in the North Atlantic, on May the 12th, 1943, the object that fell from the Liberator's bomb bay hit the water and disappeared beneath the surface. It did not detonate. It did not sink to a preset depth and explode. It began to swim, slowly, quietly, in a wide, patient circle, listening. Below it, at 90 feet, U-456 was leveling off, her crew silent at their stations, her captain listening for the rumble of depth charges that were not coming. He would hear something else in a moment. He would not have time to understand what it was. To understand what fell into the water above U-56 that afternoon, you have to go inside it. 19 inches wide, 7 feet long, 680 pounds, painted gray, blunt at the nose, tapered at the tail. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A short, fat cylinder, a drum with a propeller. But inside that drum was the future of warfare. At the front, 4 small windows opened into the sea. Behind each window sat a hydrophone, a microphone hardened for the crushing pressure of deep water, tuned to hear one very specific sound. The rhythmic beat of a submarine's propellers churning through the ocean at 24,000 cycles a second. Not the wind, not the waves, not the endless click and rustle of fish and shrimp and shifting sand. Propellers, only propellers. Behind the hydrophone sat the brain, and the brain was made of telephone parts, vacuum tubes, small glass bulbs the size of a man's thumb, the same tubes that lit up the back every radio in every American living room, the same tubes that carried voices across the copper wire from New York to Chicago. Bell Telephone Laboratories had spent 40 years perfecting them. They knew every quirk of every model. They knew how to make them small. They knew how to make them cheap. And they knew how to make them do something no one had ever asked them to do before. They knew how to make them compare. The signal from the left hydrophones was measured against the signal from the right. If the left was louder, the torpedo turned left. If the right was louder, the torpedo turned right. The signal from the upper hydrophones was measured against the lower. The rudder pitched up, the rudder pitched down. Small differences meant small corrections. Large differences meant large corrections. The torpedo did not chase. It spiraled, tightening, narrowing, homing. Behind the brain sat the body. An electric motor, 7.5 horsepower, adapted from a model that General Electric had been selling to American households for years. A battery, 48 volts, 110 amperes, that would run for 15 minutes and then die. Behind that, a single propeller, spinning quietly in the dark. At the front, packed into the hemispherical nose, sat 92 pounds of HBX explosive. 92 pounds, that was all. It was not enough to blow a U-boat apart. A conventional fleet torpedo carried 500 pounds of explosive. 92 pounds would crack a pressure hull. 92 pounds would flood a compartment. 92 pounds would force a submarine to surface where a Liberator's guns and depth charges could finish the job. That was the design. That was the intent. Fido was not a killer. Fido was a hunter that flushed its prey into the open. And here is where the story becomes something you would not expect. Because everything about this weapon, everything that made it work, was compromised by a single terrible weakness that no engineer could solve. Fido was slow. 12 knots, that was its top speed underwater. A conventional torpedo ran at 45 knots. Fido ran at 12. It was one of the slowest torpedoes ever built, a submerged U-boat at full underwater speed, made about 8 knots. Fido had a 4-knot margin, enough to close the distance, enough to catch the boat before the battery died, just barely. But on the surface, a U-boat's diesel engines could push it to 17 knots. On the surface, a U-boat could outrun Fido easily, effortlessly. It could turn the torpedo into a slow, useless fish, circling in the wake of a submarine that had already vanished over the horizon. Which meant that everything depended on one thing. The Germans could not know. If Karl Donitz ever learned that the Allies had a torpedo that could not catch a surface submarine, he would issue a single order to every U-boat in his fleet, and the war would tilt back the other way. Do not dive. Fight it out on the surface. That order would kill thousands of Allied sailors. That order could never be allowed to happen. So the men who built Fido did something that had never been done before in the history of American weapons development. They lied about what it was. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington controlled every torpedo program in the Navy. Every torpedo went through their testing procedures, their approval committees, their review boards. And in 1942, the Bureau of Ordnance was buried in problems with the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon that had been in service for years and did not work. Its experts failed. Its depth control failed. It ran too deep, or it ran in circles, or it hit its target and bounced off without detonating. The Bureau of Ordnance would have taken years to approve a new torpedo. The war did not have years, so the scientists at OSRD did something clever. They looked at the classification system, they looked at the categories, and they gave Fido a name that would keep it out of the Bureau's hands entirely. They called it the Mark 24 mine. It was not a mine, it never had been. A mine is a stationary explosive that waits for a target to come to it. Fido was the opposite of a mine. Fido went to the target. Fido chose the target. Fido thought about the target. But by calling it a mine, the men who built it accomplished 2 things at once. They avoided the paperwork, and they created a lie that would deceive German intelligence for the rest of the war. Because every time a Fido was used, every after-action report referred to it by its official name. Mark 24 mine. Every intercepted radio message, every debrief, every requisition form, mine, mine, mine. German intelligence, reading whatever fragments they could pick up, saw a word they thought they understood. They were wrong about what it meant. The secrecy went further than the name. Photographs of Fido were forbidden. Crews who dropped it were forbidden to discuss it, even with other pilots. Ground crews who loaded it into aircraft were forbidden to ask what it was. The men who assembled it at Western Electric factories in New Jersey and Illinois were told only what they needed to know to do their piece of the work. And the timeline of what those men accomplished is almost impossible to believe. December 1941, the first meeting at Harvard. October 1942, design finalized. December 1942, first prototype tested off the coast of New England. March 1943, first production units delivered to operational squadrons. 15 months. From a question asked around a conference table to a working weapon in the bomb bay of a Liberator. Modern torpedo programs take 15 years. Fido took 15 months. The first order was for 10,000 units. The Navy would later cut that order down to 4,000 because the weapon turned out to be too effective. Fewer were needed. But in the spring of 1943, When the first crates arrived at Squadron airfields in Iceland and Northern Ireland and Newfoundland, no one knew any of that yet. The pilots knew only what they had been told in closed briefings behind locked doors. Drop it in the swirl. Don't wait to see what happens. Fly away. And on the 12th of May, 1943, a Liberator from number 86 Squadron did exactly that. It dropped the object into the swirl where U-456 had disappeared, and it flew away. And Fido began to swim. It circled at 50 feet, listening, sweeping. Its hydrophones searched through the noise of the ocean, filtering out the whisper of currents, the distant crackle of fish, the low rumble of the waves overhead. It listened for a signal that did not belong. It listened for a rhythm. Below it, U-456 was leveling off. Her captain, 30-year-old Kapitän Leutnant Max Martin Teichert, had done this 100 times. Crash dive, level off, change course. Wait for the depth charges to blow themselves out in the empty water above, and then continue on the mission. He had been at war for 4 years. He knew the drill. He had commanded U-456 for a year. He has survived worse days than this. The propellers of his boat turned in the darkness, pushing water past his hull at 8 knots, 24,000 cycles per second. Fido heard it. The rudders shifted. The torpedo tightened its circle. The vacuum tubes in its brain compared left to right, up to down, and the signal grew stronger with every passing second. The 4 hydrophones locked on. The proportional homing system took over. Somewhere in the black water, 600 miles southwest of Iceland, a weapon that no one on Earth was allowed to speak of was closing on a submarine whose crew did not know it existed. And the Battle of the Atlantic was about to change. Not with a bigger explosion, with a smarter one. The explosion came from behind. Inside U-456, at 90 feet below the surface, 30-year-old Kapitän Leutnant Max Martin Teichert felt his boat shudder as if something enormous had struck the aft compartments. Lights flickered. Gauges spun. A pipe somewhere in the engine room burst, and cold seawater began to spray into the hull under pressure. There had been no warning, no sound of an approaching torpedo, no rumble of a depth charge falling through the water. No pattern, no count, just a violent, unexplained blow against the back of his ship. He gave the order to surface. He had no choice. The damage was too severe to stay submerged. His boat came up into the gray afternoon light, wounded, leaking, riding low. Teichert signaled for help. He put his gunners on the anti-aircraft cannons and held the Liberator at a wary distance through the long afternoon and into the night. But no rescue came. At first light on the 13th of May, the destroyer HMS Opportune appeared over the horizon. Teichert gave the order to dive one last time. The damage from that first mysterious explosion had been too great. U-456 sank almost at once to the ocean floor. All 49 men aboard died. Not one of them ever understood what had truly hit them the afternoon before. That is the thing you must hold in your mind.
That is the reason the secret held. Every man who could have described Fido, who could have told Berlin what he had heard and felt in the last minutes of his boat,
was on the ocean floor by the following morning. 2 days later, on the 14th of May, 1943, a PBY Catalina flying boat from United States Navy Patrol Squadron 84, based at Reykjavik, spotted a U-boat on the surface between Iceland and Greenland. The submarine dived. The Catalina dropped a Mark 24 mine into the swirl. Somewhere below, U-640 disappeared with all 49 of her crew. The first American kill. And then it kept happening in the month of May 1943. 43 German U-boats went to the bottom of the Atlantic. Some were killed by escorts. Some were killed by aircraft. Some were killed by causes that Berlin could not even properly identify. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz sat with the reports spread across his desk, and he could not understand what he was seeing. He was losing his men faster than he could replace them. Boats were leaving port and simply not turning. No survivors. No radio signals. Nothing. He wrote in his war diary, in a hand that had grown careful and small, "The enemy has succeeded in gaining the upper hand." On the 24th of May, 1943, Karl Dönitz issued the order that admitted the war he had built his life around was slipping away from him. He withdrew every wolf pack from the North Atlantic convoy routes. He pulled his submarines out. For the first time since the war began, the sea lanes were clear. He did not know why. He suspected new radar. He suspected escort carriers. He suspected better sonar, longer range aircraft, improved codes. All of that was true. All of it played a part. But the piece he never guessed, the piece that no one in Berlin ever guessed, was the small gray object dropping quietly into the water behind his diving submarines. The object, his intelligence reports, called a mine. The Germans spent the next 2 years defending themselves against threats that did not exist. They built devices to spoof active sonar. They coated their hulls in special rubber to absorb sound waves that were never sent. They designed acoustic torpedoes of their own, the T5 Zaunkönig, and fired them at Allied destroyers, believing that they had achieved a technological equivalence. They had not. The irony is almost unbearable. Germany had begun research into acoustic homing torpedoes in 1933, 10 years before Fido. They understood the physics. They understood the principle. They simply never imagined that their enemy would put an acoustic weapon inside an aircraft and drop it from the sky. They thought the future was submarines shooting at ships. The Allies thought the future was aircraft shooting at submarines. Both sides were right about the physics. Only one side was right about the war. There was one more moment that must be told. It came 13 months later on a June night in 1944 in the deep water west of the Cape Verde Islands. A Japanese submarine named I-52 was making her way from Singapore to occupied France. She was enormous, 2,500 tons. She carried a fortune in cargo: tin, rubber, quinine, opium, and 2 tons of gold packed in wooden crates meant to buy German technology for the Japanese war effort. The Allies knew she was coming. They had broken the Japanese naval codes. They had broken the German codes. They knew where she would meet her Germans and escort, and they knew when. An Avenger torpedo bomber launched from the escort carrier USS Bogue found her on the surface just before midnight. Flares lit the ocean. Depth bombs forced the submarine down. And then the Avenger dropped a pattern of small floating microphones into the water. Sonobuoys. The pilot and his crew put on their headsets and listened. Through the static, they heard it, the steady, unmistakable beat of a submarine's propellers turning in the dark water below. The Avenger dropped a Mark 24 mine into that sound, and then the crew listened as I-52 died. The recording still exists. The tape is stored in the National Archives in Washington in 2 thin film canisters marked in pencil with a date. June 24th, 1944. You can play the recording today. You can hear the pilot speaking calmly to his crew. You can hear the explosion. You can hear the long, groaning, tearing sound of a submarine hull collapsing under the weight of the sea with 95 Japanese sailors and
14 passengers and 3 German technicians and 2 tons of gold inside it, all of them going down together through 17,000 feet of dark water.
It is one of the only audio recordings of a submarine sinking in the Second World War. In 1995, an American treasure hunter named Paul Tidwell located the wreck of I-52 on the ocean floor. The conning tower was intact. The hull number was still visible. And behind the conning tower, in the pressure hull, was a single, ragged hole. The kind of hole that 92 pounds of HBX explosive would make, arriving suddenly from below, without warning. Fido was there. Over the course of the Second World War, Allied aircraft launched 204 of these weapons in combat. 37 of them sank submarines outright. 18 more damaged their targets so badly the boats had to be abandoned or finished off by other means. The kill rate was roughly 18%. Twice as effective as the depth charges it replaced. The original order for 10,000 Fidos was cut down to 4,000. There was no need to build more. The weapon was too good. In May of 1945, in the northern German port of Flensburg, Karl Dönitz, now the head of the German government following Hitler's death, signed the documents of surrender. He was 54 years old. He had lost nearly 800 U-boats and 28,000 of his 40,000 submariners, the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in any modern war. Boys, most of them, volunteers. He never knew about Fido. He would go to his grave in 1980 without understanding what had really turned his war around in the black month of May 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted 2,074 days. 3,500 Allied merchant ships were sunk. 72,000 Allied sailors and merchant mariners died in the freezing water. 783 German U-boats went to the bottom of the sea. It was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war, and through the last 2 years of that campaign, in the dark water below every convoy, there was a small gray weapon that no one was allowed to talk about. It listened, it thought, it hunted. It cost $1,800. It was made from telephone parts, a household electric motor, and a battery you might find in a family car. It was built in 15 months by men who had never designed a weapon in their lives, and it changed the way every war has been fought since. Every homing missile in every arsenal in every navy on Earth today is a descendant of Fido. Every torpedo that hears its target. Every smart bomb that finds its own way home. All of them go back to a meeting at Harvard 3 days after Pearl Harbor, and to the men around that table who looked at an impossible question and said yes. They called it a mine, so the enemy would not learn its name. It sank 37 submarines, and the men inside those submarines died without ever hearing it coming. Now you know.